Chapter 26. Shadows of Justice and Light of Discovery, Part 4. The dwarven council chamber was alive with muted murmurs as the party entered. A row of polished stone chairs arranged in a semicircle faced the entrance, each occupied by dwarves clad in ceremonial robes. The heavy doors of the chamber groaned shut behind Lucas, Mina, and Thomas, their sound echoing like a toll of judgment. In the center of the room stood a figure that was distinctly out of place. An elf, tall and graceful, their presence stark against the squat and rugged dwarves. The elf's silver hair shimmered in the low light of the chamber, cascading over a tunic embroidered with intricate patterns of vines and stars. They held a calm yet commanding air, their pale green eyes scanning the trio as they approached. "Welcome," the elf began, their voices smooth and deliberate as flowing water. "I am Altheris, envoy of Haliriel." Lucas felt a faint ripple of telepathic energy from the elf, a presence distinct from the chaotic thoughts he often encountered. This one was controlled, like a tightly wound string. He resisted the urge to probe further, instead taking his seat beside Mina and Thomas at the long stone table reserved for the guests of honor, or scrutiny, as it often felt. "Altheris," said one of the dwarven council members, his voice gruff. "The council is convened. Speak your purpose." Altheris inclined their head. "I will speak plainly, for time is a commodity we cannot waste. The eastern continent, long untouched by the Empire's direct influence, has become a site of grave danger. One of the disciples of the Empire, the so-called Disciple of Air, has been apprehended by forces allied with Haliriel. This individual is powerful, unpredictable, and intricately connected to the Sent One's prophecy." Lucas tensed at the mention of the prophecy, his mind flashing back to the glyphs in the temple. Mina's hand brushed his briefly under the table, grounding him. "The Disciple of Air," Altheris continued, their gaze steady, "is not just an agent of chaos. He seeks something, or someone. Our records indicate he was searching for two individuals before his capture. A man with the power to move mountains and a woman whose speed allows her to see the future." Thomas exchanged a glance with Mina, whose expression had hardened. Lucas remained still, though the weight of Altheris's words settled heavily on his shoulders. "These descriptions align," Altheris added, their gaze flickering to Lucas and Mina, "with accounts of your recent deeds. The destruction in Kingston and the events in Brumkorath have reached even Haliriel's ears. It seems you are at the heart of this prophecy." "We've never encountered this disciple," Mina said, her voice firm. "And as for what happened in Kingston, we're still piecing that together ourselves." The elf nodded, acknowledging her words without conceding the point. "Be that as it may, the Disciple of Air's actions are tied to your fates. It is imperative that we understand why. This is why I have come to request your presence in Haliriel, to join us in preparing a mission to the eastern continent. There, we hope to extract answers from the Disciple and counter the Empire's growing influence." "And what's in it for us?" Thomas interjected, his tone cautious but not dismissive. "We've got enough enemies without throwing in a disciple of the Empire." Altheris's expression softened into what could almost be called sympathy. "We are not blind to the dangers you face, both from the Empire and from the political forces of the Central Lands. Haliriel offers you immunity and protection from those who seek to harm you. The World Police will find no allies among the elves in their pursuit of you. With us, you will have sanctuary." Mina's brows furrowed. "Immunity from the World Police is tempting, but what happens after? You're asking us to go halfway across the world on what sounds like a suicide mission." Altheris's calm faltered for the first time, though only slightly. "The mission will be perilous, yes, but we believe the answers you seek, about yourselves, about the Sent Ones, and about the prophecy, lie with the Disciple. We do not make this request lightly. The stakes are high, and the cost of ignorance is higher still." Silence hung in the chamber. The dwarves on the council exchanged wary glances, their distrust of the elves evident despite their alliance. Lucas could feel their thoughts skittering around like insects. Suspicions, calculations, fears. Finally, Altheris stepped closer, their voice lowering slightly. "There is another reason for our urgency. While the Disciple of Air is currently in our custody, his power is not fully contained. The magics we use to restrain him weaken each day. Should he escape, the devastation he could unleash is unimaginable. Your presence may be the key to understanding how to neutralize him for good. Lucas met Altheris's gaze, searching for any hint of deception. Instead, he found resolve, a deep conviction that this mission was more than politics or survival. It was necessity. Mina broke the silence. If we agree, what guarantees do we have that this doesn't end with us trapped in Haliriel, or worse? You're asking for a lot of trust from people who don't have much reason to trust anyone. Altheris inclined their head again, their calm returning. Your concerns are valid, and we are prepared to address them. But for now, I ask only that you consider what I have said. The choice, as always, is yours. The elf stepped back, signaling the end of their address. The dwarves murmured amongst themselves, some clearly unhappy with the elf's proposal. Lucas exchanged a glance with Mina and Thomas, his mind already churning through the implications. The request was monumental, the risks overwhelming, but the answers they sought, and the promises of protection, were difficult to ignore. As the council prepared to deliberate, Lucas leaned back in his chair, his thoughts a tempest of doubts and possibilities. The elf's words lingered in his mind, echoing like a whisper in the dark. The choice is yours. The negotiation resumed with an air of tension so thick that it weighed on Lucas like a physical burden. The chamber, once alive with quiet murmurs, now carried a sharper edge. Altheris stood poised, their expression unreadable, while the dwarven council members whispered in gruff tones that barely concealed their discontent. Thomas lowered, his palms flat on the cold stone table. "We've heard your terms," he said to Altheris, his voice steady. "Before we agree, we need assurances. Real ones. If we commit to this mission, we reserve the right to withdraw if we feel the risks outweigh the potential gains." Altheris met his gaze without hesitation. "That is not unreasonable. While Haliriel would prefer full cooperation, we understand your need for autonomy. The clause you propose will be included, though I must caution you. Leaving midway could jeopardize the mission and place the lives of our people at risk." Lucas felt a flicker of annoyance at the elf's calm confidence. The stakes were clear, but the offer of protection came with strings, as always. He resisted the urge to sigh, keeping his expression neutral. "What about our safety en route to Haliriel?" Mina asked, cutting through the growing tension. "The world police, the Empire, there's no shortage of threats. Will your people ensure we get there in one piece?" Altheris nodded. "A contingent of elvish rangers will accompany you from Brumkorath to Haliriel. Our scouts are well versed in avoiding unwanted attention. You will have our protection until you reach the city." Lucas noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The dwarves, who had remained silent during this exchange, were beginning to bristle. Their murmurs grew louder, their eyes narrowing at the mention of elvish rangers. Lucas didn't need telepathy to sense their unease, but the surface thoughts trickling through his mind confirmed it. "They're bringing armed elves through our mountains?" One dwarf thought bitterly, his voice in Lucas's mind tinged with suspicion. How convenient for them. Another thought flared louder, filled with resentment. "And they're offering these strangers more than we ever received. Typical elves, always scheming." Lucas clenched his fists under the table, his frustration simmering. Now, he had spent his life navigating other people's emotions, their fleeting judgments and petty rivalries. But the dwarves' hostility toward the elves was a stark reminder of how deep those divisions ran. One of the dwarven council members finally broke the silence. "This arrangement benefits the elves more than it does Brumkorath," he said, his tone sharp. "We've provided sanctuary to these outsiders, yet we see little in return. If the party intends to leave with your rangers, envoy, the council must consider appropriate compensation." Mina's jaw tightened. "Compensation?" she repeated, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. The dwarf, a broad-shouldered man with a thick gray beard, didn't flinch. "Yes, Brumkorath is no charity. Your presence here has drawn attention we did not ask for. A price must be paid for the burden placed on our people." Lucas could feel the sting of the insult, not just in the words, but in the council's collective thoughts. It wasn't just about money or resources, it was about control. The dwarves saw their alliance with the elves as a threat, and by extension, they viewed the party as pawns in a game they had no desire to play. "We didn't ask to be dragged into your politics," Lucas said, his voice low but edged with anger. "We came here seeking safety, and we've done nothing to harm your city. Now you're demanding a ransom to let us leave." The dwarf's gaze hardened. "It is not a ransom, boy. It is the price of ensuring Brumkorath's stability. You carry danger with you, and that danger doesn't leave without cost." "Enough," Thomas said, his voice rising just enough to command attention. "We're not here to haggle over imaginary debts. If this council wants compensation, let's hear their terms. Otherwise, stop wasting our time." The chamber fell silent, save for the murmurs of a few council members, who continued their quiet deliberations. Altheris watched the exchange with interest, their serene demeanor unshaken, but their gaze flickering with faint amusement. Finally, another dwarf spoke, his tone slightly more measured. "We are not unreasonable. If the elves wish to escort these individuals through our lands, we request a gesture of goodwill, a contribution of supplies or resources to Brumkorath as a sign of mutual respect." Altheris turned to the dwarf, their expression softening. "Haliriel values its relationship with Brumkorath. We will provide what is needed to ensure this transition is smooth. However, I must insist that these individuals are not to be treated as commodities." Lucas felt a flicker of gratitude toward the elf, though it did little to soothe his frustration. He glanced at Mina, who gave him a brief nod, her green eyes reflecting her own simmering anger. "We'll agree to your terms," Thomas said, his tone carefully controlled. "But let me make one thing clear. We're not here to be bargaining chips. Any attempt to undermine this mission will have consequences, not just for us, but for everyone involved." The council exchanged uneasy glances, their murmurs quieting. Lucas could still sense their discontent, the bitter undercurrent of mistrust that ran beneath every word. As the negotiations drew to a close, Lucas leaned back in his chair, his mind churning. The dwarves' transactional approach had left a bitter taste in his mouth, and his growing mistrust of their motives was impossible to ignore. Whatever lay ahead in Haliriel, he knew one thing for certain: their journey would only grow more complicated from here. The council chamber felt suffocating. The weight of expectations, the layers of political maneuvering, and the unspoken tensions between the elves and dwarves pressed down on Lucas like a physical burden. His patience, already frayed by the events of the past weeks, was wearing thin. He sat rigid in his chair, his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Altheris's calm voice carried through the room as they elaborated on the proposed mission. "Once your part in the Eastern Continent mission is complete, you will be free to decide your next course. However, we urge you to consider the gravity of what lies ahead. The Disciple of Air is no mere opponent, and their reach extends beyond the lands of the Empire." Lucas narrowed his eyes, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. "And what happens after that? Let's assume we succeed. What guarantees do we have that we won't be treated as pawns again? That we'll be able to return to Brumkorath or go wherever we choose without being hunted or imprisoned?" Altheris regarded him with their usual composure, though there was a flicker of unease in their gaze. "The elves of Haliriel are not in the business of imprisoning those who aid us. Once your task is complete, you will have our protection, as agreed." "That's not enough," Lucas snapped. "I've seen how promises like that turn out. We've been manipulated and lied to at every step since we left Kingston. I want something concrete. I want it in writing that we'll be allowed to leave Haliriel freely, without interference from you, the World Police, or anyone else." Mina placed a steadying hand on Lucas's arm, her touch grounding him, but her expression reflected her agreement. "Lucas is right," she said, her voice firm but measured. "We need assurances. Without them, this deal is nothing more than a trap waiting to spring." Thomas, who had been silent for most of the exchange, finally spoke, his tone low and deliberate. "We've come this far on the promise of safety and freedom. We won't move forward unless those promises are ironclad. If Haliriel can't guarantee that, this conversation ends here." The dwarves shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions ranging from irritation to mild amusement. To them, this demand was yet another complication in a situation already teetering on the edge of their tolerance. Altheris clasped their hands together, their expression thoughtful. "Your mistrust is understandable," they said after a pause. "Very well. Haliriel will provide a formal declaration of your freedom to depart once your role in this mission is fulfilled. You have my word that you will not be detained or obstructed, provided you do not act against the interests of Haliriel or its allies." "That's not enough," Lucas said, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. "Your word might carry weight in Haliriel, but it means nothing to the World Police or the Empire. I want guarantees that extend beyond your borders." The elf's composure finally cracked, their brow furrowing in frustration. "You ask for what may not be possible," Altheris replied, their tone sharpening. "Haliriel's influence does not extend to the World Police or the Empire. We can only offer you protection within our lands." Lucas's jaw tightened, and for a moment the room felt as if it might erupt into open conflict. Then Thomas stepped in, his voice a calming force. "We're not asking for the impossible. What Lucas is saying is that we need more than vague assurances. If we're going to risk our lives for this, we need to know there's a future waiting for us on the other side." Altheris nodded slowly, their frustration giving way to reluctant understanding. "Then let us formalize the agreement. Haliriel will issue written assurances of your safe departure and grant you asylum should you need it. While we cannot control the actions of the World Police, we will do everything within our power to shield you from them." Lucas's gaze hardened. He wasn't satisfied, but he knew they were unlikely to get more. He exchanged a glance with Mina, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "Fine," Lucas said finally, his voice laced with resignation. "But if you go back on this agreement, if we find ourselves betrayed, I swear we won't hesitate to walk away from this mission, no matter what's at stake." Altheris inclined their head, their expression unreadable. Understood. The dwarves, who had watched the exchange with growing impatience, began to rise from their seats. "If the elves are willing to commit to these terms, then so be it," one council member said gruffly. "But Brum-Korath will hold no responsibility for what happens beyond our borders." Lucas didn't miss the faint sneer in the dwarf's tone, nor the lingering resentment in their thoughts. The dwarves' mistrust of the elves was palpable, and it only added to Lucas's growing unease. As the council session concluded and the terms of the agreement were finalized, the party found themselves alone in the chamber once more. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. "We did what we had to," Mina said softly, her voice breaking the silence. Thomas nodded, though his expression was grim. "Let's hope it's enough." Lucas remained silent, his thoughts a turbulent storm of frustration and doubt. The elves had agreed to their demands, but the lingering sense of manipulation, of being pieces on a larger chessboard, gnawed at him. As they prepared to depart for Haliriel, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far bigger and more dangerous than they realized. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was clear. Their journey was only just beginning.